All right, imagine that you're hiring for internship and you got two current college students you're really excited about. And the only difference between the two is that one has a 3.8 GPA and one has a 2.8 GPA. Same school, same major. Are you confident in saying that the student with the higher GPA has a better grasp of the material or is more knowledgeable in that area than the student with the lower GPA? Now, if we switch schools and said that one goes to a different school, does that change things? What if we look at the major courses GPA instead of GPA as a cumulative and they were more similar? And so for the veterans that have been working with HR and been doing hiring processes for a long time, there's different ways to get around that. But at the end of the day, I think if you're talking about American education, we have to talk about the grading system. And we have to talk about that number serving as a gatekeeper a lot of times. Also serving as a divider to divide the have and the have-nots. And really closing people out to opportunities, whether it be internships, whether it be other employment opportunities, whether it be scholarships, or whether it's just the effectiveness of the institution or the school. And so this idea of how we grade and what we grade is very important and has many, I think, negative implications. If we go back into, our own educational experience or even talking to those around us, I think we can all think of the different times that we had negative either associations or just negative encounters with grades. And some people might say, well, of course, if you were a bad student, you had a negative experience. And that's not always the case. I've talked before about a course that I had in college where I had a perfect 100%, and it was a negative experience because I never learned anything. I didn't learn one thing, and it hurt me going forward. And while it might seem on paper as if it was a positive, it was ultimately a negative experience in my education. But I think a lot further back to earlier years for students, and a lot of students that I've interacted with and people that those are the times where you really start to formulate what you think about education and what you think about the whole system and teachers and grading. And those negative experiences really can make a huge impact on the student for better or worse. And when we're talking about grading students, it all goes back to this question of can we prove this correlation that you actually know what you are doing? And so one of the things I think about that I've seen from a couple different institutions, and I wouldn't say that this is the national trend or anything, but a couple of times I have seen that a lot of schools or a number of schools have said that their students graduating with more mid-tier GPAs make more money, than the peers with a higher GPA, especially over time. And there have been a recent trend in human resources of thinking this idea that the students with higher GPAs, they don't really necessarily have the ability to fail. They don't have the ability to be innovative and creative because they want to take the safe route. And there have been some psychological studies as well with higher achieving students and how they rather take the safe route than the route that they know or that they think they might fail. And so I think for some of these students, and I might be misquoting it, but I think for some of these students, they rather take the route where they know they're going to miss than they can avoid that question or whatever the situation is, rather than going with the route where it's unsure. And so this just speaks to the high achieving nature of these students, and really they're scared to fail more than they're driven to succeed. And so you see students with lower GPAs who some people feel are just more engaged in their time in school, and they engage in more creative activities. They're not as obsessed with homework and academics, but they still can show the aptitude to get it done. And so that's kind of some of the thinking. I'm not 100% one way or the other on it, but that's some of the thinking that we see. And so ultimately, when we're talking about higher education, the result is, hey, the better you do academically should say the better you're prepared to go into the workforce in any given field. And we could talk about the workforce in another episode, but we've seen through some people's trends that that's not entirely true. And now we're starting to see in some people's trend that not entirely enthusiastic about hiring overachieving students. And so there's that. Now, even with that being said, we got to go back to the question of not just work, but education. Does this GPA, can we prove that it correlates that this student knows the material? And I talked a little bit about accountability in the last episode, and this kind of morphs over into that, where this is the idea that we have to have a way to be accountable, especially on the lower levels when we're talking about children. We have to have a way to show that we are being effective and that students are actually learning. And so the not age old, but one of the long-standing traditions that we know in America is the quiz, test, grading system. And so for, many years, starting very early, we got introduced into the system of grading and being graded for things. And again, there is that systematic way to test the knowledge, but ultimately that grade just becomes a reflection of your ability to complete and get it done in the context of that classroom. So it might be with a certain teacher and or professor and how they like things done. Or maybe it's just a certain course or class where you need to maneuver it this way with these type of assignments, or you can get help from here. Even thinking back then when we had one teacher in many subjects, in certain subjects you knew, okay, well, I'm gonna have to do this, either work harder, or I'm gonna have to go ask my mom, or I got my friend that's really good at it. You have to find these ways to then cope in that classroom and then get to the completion. And so I've talked about getting a college degree in general. And I talk a lot about how that really shows the ability to, or at least the determination to persevere, because on every level, no matter who you are, you gotta persevere to get to that college degree. And it doesn't mean you're smart, doesn't mean it was easy for you, or doesn't mean you're better, but it does mean you had to persevere. And that looks like a lot of different ways. And I think similarly, that's how grades are, especially on those lower levels, is showing your ability not to exactly master concepts, but to really maneuver the system. And that doesn't mean that you don't completely learn, you miss all the information, or you completely don't take away anything from the class. You can pick that up, but along the way, I think many people start to understand that this isn't measuring my intelligence. This is really measuring my obedience to more of an extent. And so we can extrapolate that to standardized testing, and we know all the pushback about that. But putting myself back in those shoes and reflecting on it, especially as me, a person that was, I guess you would consider, higher achieving for all of my time before college, it really seemed that way, that it was measuring how smart I was. And you attach some of your value to that grade, and it comes with a lot of the accolades and recognition and all the other things. It's just what you're taught socially and what we're socialized to believe, that, hey, you got good grades, you're doing a good job, and we're not really going to question it. You know what I mean? So if I come home and I have a report card full of A's, my parents aren't going to quiz me to make sure I actually know the material. They're going to be like, okay, well, you did a good job. You obviously know what you're doing. And to that extent, with me and my grades, a lot of time my parents left me alone as far as doing work. Like, obviously, like if stuff happened, they'd be on me about it, but they left me alone as far as like helping me and supporting. It wasn't like, we're going to make sure you're doing your homework. We're going to sit there and watch you do your homework, or make sure we try to help you with it. Very early on, it was just like, okay, we got it. Because people, by and large, we defer to the experts, quote unquote, and those are the educators. So if you get that report card, you get those A's, it should tell you as a parent that your student is learning material. And then as a student, it tells you, okay, I'm doing a good job. And so even going up into junior year with the ACT, for me, it was a measure of intelligence for me. And it wasn't until many years later that I could understand the context around it and what it actually meant. And then you get a lot of students that very early on check out of the education system because maybe they know they're smart in different ways, or maybe they know that likely there's other circumstances outside the classroom that affect their performance. And so after a while, you get some people that either friends with or just see, where it was like, school is dumb, or school is stupid, and grades are stupid, or tests is stupid, you know what I mean? Or this is dumb, this doesn't improve my intelligence. And for me, a long time, it was just, well, you just deflecting, like you clearly not doing well. So obviously you're going to believe it doesn't show that you're smart. And of course, growing up, you kind of go back and look at it. And for some people, I think it's definitely a deflection, because as natural creatures, we want to have positivity. We want to do the things that get us that positivity. But once you feel like, you're not capable of it, then it's a whole different story. But anyway, so for some people, it is a deflection. But for some people, it was, realization that education doesn't just happen sitting in the classroom, and that the things can't always just be determined by a test. And so with all that being said, it still goes back to this idea of how do we actually measure? Because again, I think it's two things. I think it is the system itself, as far as there are flaws like the standardized test or any other test, that there's just is no way to really capture everything for every student in a one size fits all. But I think on top of that, there is just all the pressure of what grades mean, again, as being gatekeepers. And I'm not necessarily against there being gatekeepers, but I do feel that we can get a little closer in correlation with the way we're measuring student learning. And so let's just kind of dive into that. So when we're talking about grading and understanding knowledge, you can do these assignments, you can do these assignments, you can do these quizzes, these tests, and you can weight them different ways. You can do projects, you can do a lot of these things. But I think if you stick to that traditional model, you're not always giving students a chance to demonstrate, because we're never going to be able to fully know. As I've said before, with accountability, to an extent, this is all self-reported data. Even if you're observing a student, you're looking at their work, it's still kind of a self-report. We're relying on whatever the student produces. So we're never going to know 100%, like look in your brain, this. So we got to look at ways that students can demonstrate it. And so for a long time, we looked at tests to do that. And tests just has inherent problems. And again, it doesn't work for every student. So one of the ways is, of course, to vary up the different avenues that students have a chance to demonstrate their knowledge in the subject. And from there, you can weight the points and do the points in a different way to then make it a little more equal. And to the credit of a lot of educators, I've seen a lot more innovativeness on the higher ed side, especially at my institution, than I did when I was an undergrad, or that I thought would be possible right now. And so I'm seeing a lot of professors and teachers go different routes with it to make it a more equitable grading system. But at the end of the day, again, there's a lot of those old school traditions rooted in there. And so, again, looking at the grades, it creates this anxiety for some students where, again, it's this pressure not to fail instead of, the ambition to succeed. And I think that some of the ways that some people have tried to combat this, and I know there's different places outside of the U.S. and some schools that tried to, pilot this, and charters that try to do this, that they really lean more on the direct demonstration. So like project-based, speaking, all that type of things. Kind of like you think of a oral presentation where you get up and you talk about this subject so that we actually know that you know what you're talking about, almost like a dissertation or thesis defense. And so there's some areas that they favor that a lot more. And that helps the, whoever evaluates the teacher to see that the student, again, actually knows it. And for me, I understand that not everybody's extrovert or not everybody's a public speaker, but I do feel that for me, the highest form of knowledge is being able to teach it. And so when you know it the best, you're able to teach it to somebody. The step below that for me is being able to not confidently, but effectively articulate it. And so I do believe in that as well. I do believe that that would be a much more effective way for you to demonstrate a student's knowledge, because as it stands now, a lot of it is regurgitation. A lot of it is simple recall. And you can remember facts, you can remember different things for a short term and then dump it, and then no longer, down the road, remember how to use it or anything. But when you're actually taking the educational journey to know the knowledge, then it takes a lot more, especially when you want to articulate it, it takes a lot more investment. It takes a lot more synthesis. It takes a lot more ability to reflect and to understand what it is that you were learning. And I think that in the end, if you're able to articulate that either through a multi, level project where I feel like there should be some writing, there should be a presentation, and whatever else. But I think in that culmination, that should show you. Now, it doesn't mean that exactly that's the only thing that you get a grade on. Some people do it where it is more of a form of participation. And I do like that because it takes the pressure off of the student to try and overdo it or be too scared to attempt it. It's more about you trying. And when you can just try, then you really open up the possibility for that student to dive in, because it's not so much you just being measured by something anymore. It's not so much, looking at just the grade, is you learning for learning's sake. So one instance that I talk about a lot, and people probably say, why you talk about it so much, but I believe it's incredibly impactful. My sophomore year, freshman, sophomore year of college, I had a course that was a business English writing course. And so the first day the professor came in And she was a really nice lady. Just, you could tell she's just very, nice and open lady. And she said, hey, I understand that college is a busy time, fun time, stressful time, and you got a lot of other things to worry about. And sometimes grades can really add pressure. And she was like, so what I do in my class is I have a grade contract. She was like, basically, if you sign this contract, you have a guaranteed B in this class. And you just got to follow the rules of the contract. So the rules were pretty simple. It's basically you have to complete the assignments by the due date unless you have a written excuse or talk to the professor, all that stuff. And it was a certain percentage of class that you had to attend. You didn't have to attend like every single class and stuff like that. And there was really like no test. And so basically, if you follow those rules, you got to be. It didn't matter. Like, and you had to actually do the assignment. So if the assignment was to write a cover letter, you couldn't write a 2-sentence story, about your friend. It had to actually be the assignment. But if it wasn't great, you wouldn't get, a F. You would still get your full points. And she would give you feedback on it that you could use to improve later and throughout the class. And then she basically said that if you wanted an A, that you would basically put in some extra work. So not like extra credit, but if you put in high quality work and use the feedback and start doing high quality work, then you could receive an A. But basically, if you just did the work, you got a B. And so at first, I really was skeptical of this thought process. I'm just like, well, that doesn't make sense because I'm going for the A. I'm still, in college, not as much, but I was still, a high achieving kid. And really for me, this had to be sophomore year because for me, I was like, anything that is associated with my major, I got to go hard at. So I was like, I want the A. And so I was like, if I put in this work, because there was a certain point in class where it was like, okay, you good, you can go. And if other people want to stay for the rest of the time and get help, you could do that. So I'm like, if I put in the work, if I stay with the professor, if I put in high quality stuff and I get an A, and these people do the bare minimum and get a B, I was like, just how is that going to be fair? But what I realized before I even, got into the work is that now that I didn't have the pressure of the grade and worrying about what I would have in the class, I was more free to engage in the actual assignment. So even though I was skeptical before we got into the work, once we got to our first, lessons and assignments, I was like, I'm paying more attention. I'm more into it because it's my major, but also because I understood that there wasn't this added pressure of failing. And so I thought that was one of the most impactful experiences that I've had in education. It opened my eyes at a time where I was really young and didn't understand what I was looking at. But now looking back, I'm just like, this is what we should be looking for. And I see some people on different levels pushing towards that now or moving towards that and still figuring out how exactly they want to do it to make it equitable. But for so long in education, and especially on the lower levels where we have not seen much innovation outside of privately funded charter schools, and a lot of them aren't great, but outside of that, we haven't seen a lot of innovation. And we got to start moving to ways that can make this more engaging. And so I talked a little bit about course content, and I won't talk too much about it here, but though it kind of intertwines into the same thing. So I'm thinking of one particular school that was privately, it was more like a academy for, high achieving students. And I had a former colleague that worked at one. He was telling me how it works. And so on top of the oral presentations, they didn't get grades. They did the final oral presentation or project or whatever it was. And it was actually judged by like the community. So very much like a dissertation defense or whatever. And so there was that part where they removed the grades, but then there was also where they had connected curriculum. So kind of like if you think like a common reading, like how people want a common reading to work in colleges, but it doesn't always work. They would have a theme. And so and this would go probably like every 4 to 6 weeks or however long it was. The theme might be World War I. And so in all your subjects, you're learning about World War I in a different perspective. So you're learning about the math. You might be talking about the economy or how they did things at that time, or how to, whatever. If you're doing mathematics with the steel they use to make weapons, however it might be. In art, you're talking about the art of the time. Obviously, history, you're going into the more details. English, you're looking at literature from that time, you're writing about it. And so they had connected curriculum. And I think that goes hand in hand with this idea. Not to say that it has to be exactly like that, especially not in colleges. Those courses are different. But on the lower levels, I think that goes hand in hand with this idea of removing grades. Because yes, you might not have the pressure to fail anymore, and it might help you engage, but it's still going to come down to some content as well. And so having content that I think is engaging, and you can do some things that are modern or related to concepts that are modern for students, but I don't think it's like, hey, kids don't care about Romeo and Juliet, let's never talk about it. I don't think it's necessarily that, and that's a random example. I do think you can still talk about the traditional topics and whatnot. But again, when you remove that pressure of failing, and then when you also add in this feature of really deep diving into the subject, then I think we open up the doors for where we can have meaningful grades. And so not our traditional ABCD, but however we want to make the system, we can start at least, I think, looking at students and how they perform and know a little more clearly that they know the material. And it's not really just a guessing game. And so even back to my example earlier, it's not just the GPA. Because like I said, I had a class, perfect 100% A+. You could say, wow, Terry, you really know this stuff. I didn't know anything. So you got that problem, but then you also got the problem of just varying standards. And so, as I mentioned, if two students went to two different schools, that could mean a lot, a difference in their education. So you might have a student from school A with a 3.9, a student from school B with a 2.8, and student from school A might not know nothing. And so there's that problem as well. And so I just think that, looking at our traditional grading system, looking at especially that GPA, it really, I think it takes the legs out from a lot of students, and it really stops them before they get going. And it just becomes this task of completion. And I talked again about course content and what the purpose of education is, and not to get too deep back into that from episode 1, but to say this, that we are at a point where education is almost exclusively just a product to help you get ahead. And the big issue with that is that it just becomes a race to complete things. It is not done with any sincerity. And that's on every level. Like I said, I'm getting ready for, pretty much graduated now, a master's program. And I can tell you that there's people I'm around, not just here, but in the whole circle, in the whole higher education in general, in any type of master's program, where it's the same. Like you got a degree and you don't really know a whole lot. You just did what it took to complete it. And people are perfectly fine with that. And so that is one of the major issues with the idea of just the grading system as it stands. And so not only are you hurting the people that don't participate in jumping through the hoops, but you're also hurting the people that you claim are the benefit or the benefiters. Is that a word? Beneficiaries? And so they a lot of times don't actually know what they were supposed to know. And that's a big issue as well. So I think a good connection between accountability and assessment that I talked about last time and this as well, because grades come in as one of the biggest factors when it comes to accountability. That are we teaching and are we doing well? And again, not only when it benefits you as a student to get the good grade, but when it benefits you as a teacher to have a high pass rate, when it benefits you as a school to have a high pass rate, graduation rate, all that, then, it just becomes something that isn't the same. And I think this might be problematic, but I just thought about this right now. And I'm sure there's a lot of votes against it for different reasons, but I would like to think that maybe there needs to be some outside party that can do that. And so if we ever did get to a more demonstration-based academic evaluation system, maybe it's as simple as having those people come in and evaluate the student and then assigning them what they did. Now, there's a lot of manpower, woman power, and all that, but I don't know. That idea just popped in my head. So anyway, I talked about this long enough, and there's probably even more we can get into about the psychology of grades and all those different things. But I think those are the major points that I wanted to hit on. When we're looking at a brighter future, I do think that includes a real reform and reshaping of grades. And I'm hopeful because I've seen it on the higher ed side from more innovative and more concerned professors who have found ways to be a lot more equitable in their grading, and they capture more of the work that's put in and the work that is learned, rather than just, the arbitrary stand up there, here's your test, oh, you failed it, you don't know nothing. So anyway, go to the comment section. Let me know what you think about the subject. Please share it around. Love to get these conversations started on some level. And until next episode.